This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to leave diet culture behind and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beefing. Now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in, stacking extra cheese.
Hey there, welcome to episode 168 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Heidi Schauster, a health at every size dietitian, eating disorder specialist, and author of the new book, Nourish, How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body, and Self. We talked about unlearning diet culture messaging, connecting with our body's inner wisdom, gentle nutrition as an act of self-care, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. It's the first one that we've done in a very long time that addresses gentle nutrition, and I promise it's going to be really interesting. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Kate, who writes, "Hi, Christy. I've been listening to your podcast for a while and have recommended it to friends who've told me what a lifeline it's been in bringing them out of very unhealthy relationships with food. Yours is a welcome and necessary voice in the din of diet culture and commercialism that aims to lower self-esteem for profit. I'd love to get your input on something. I was anorexic when I was 17 to 18 years old and have since struggled with binge eating, anorexic thoughts, and occasional bulimia since then, about 17 years. I've read a great deal on the subject, had many eating disorder counselors, and tried intuitive eating at various points because ultimately it seemed like the right thing to do. I felt like I was able to break away from the bondage that is the expectation on women's bodies and expectation of beauty as a prerequisite to success. I got quite political, blamed a lot of people and systems, and really believed that I had the answer. Bow out of diet culture, healthism, and clean eating, and I'd naturally find my way. I completely recognize that I have never done a course in intuitive eating and perhaps haven't given it a fair try. However, I came to notice after about 15 years of varying degrees of success, but no real reduction in binging, that when I felt stable and confident, food wasn't an issue. I could have anything I wanted in the house, and it didn't mean I would binge on it. When I was anxious, though, I would eat to stuff down this fluttery feeling of being completely terrified and out of control. Sometimes the quote-unquote trigger was eating a particular food that made me worry about putting on weight, but most of the time it was something unrelated. I would get up from my study table and just eat whatever was in the house, not necessarily the quote-unquote binge foods as I so categorized them at the time. Eating in that way was an automatic response to reading something I didn't understand or something that set a degree of expectation in terms of the work that I had to produce. It wasn't to do with the food. I was eating to stuff down anxiety, pure and simple. It had become a response to anxiety, not to diet culture. The reason I'm explaining this is that anxiety as a root cause or trigger of binge eating isn't something you speak so much about in your podcast, and I wonder if you'd like to explore that more. I guess my question is it perhaps easier to take aim at the diet industry, laudable though that is, than to look at behavioral reactions and mental health solutions? So thanks, Kate, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers are for informational and educational purposes only, as is this podcast in general, and it's not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think there are many people who binge in response to anxiety, and I definitely want to get into that. But first of all, just to answer your question about whether it's easier to take aim at the diet industry than to look at mental health solutions, in my view, they're actually inextricable from one another. That is, we can't talk about mental health and recovering from disordered eating at the individual level if we don't also talk about recovery at the societal level, which means recovery from diet culture, recovery from fat phobia and weight stigma, and all the rest. The cultural pressure to be thin and eat the so-called right foods and be quote-unquote healthy and all the other elements of diet culture that I'm always talking about here, those things are either the immediate catalyst for disordered eating for most people, or they're somewhere in the mix. And I would argue they're somewhere in the mix for everyone in this culture. And so I highlight cultural factors the most because they are at least one of the immediate catalysts for the majority of people in my experience. Like, people are told to lose weight, or they gain weight and decide to go on a diet diet, or they get bullied and abused by peers or parents or doctors because of their weight. And that triggers off the disordered eating. That's oftentimes what sparks it in the first place. And as a lot of my guests on the podcast can attest, and I didn't particularly choose them because they had that story. It's just how it's shaken out. It's sort of like you could do a little mini study on the guests in my podcast. And I think for the most part, a lot of them had this experience of having it start with something to do with their body size, or being shamed for their body size. And of course, there are other individual factors that come up like trauma and self-esteem and other life circumstances that play a role in triggering disordered eating. And I would never want to discount that for anyone, because even the people for whom weight stigma is the immediate catalyst, there might also be some form of trauma that's outside of the weight stigma. Because of course, weight stigma is trauma unto itself, but there could also be some kind of other abuse going on, for example. So definitely don't want to discount that. And I would say that a significant minority of the people that I've seen in clinical practice had their disordered eating start as a response to trauma, some form of trauma that was not diet culture. And it was a way to self-soothe, like a way to soothe anxiety, for example, as you're discussing. And I think a significant minority of the podcast guests that I've had here too have had that experience. But the thing is, those behaviors don't exist in a vacuum. So if you start eating to self-soothe after experiencing trauma, for example, you're not doing that in a culture that's like, hey, do what you got to do to get through the day. And also let me help you process your trauma. You're doing it in a culture that's like, oh my God, you're eating so much, you're going to gain weight. And that's absolutely unacceptable. You need to lose weight stat. And PS trauma, what are you even talking about? Just suck it up and move on. That's our culture. So even when people start eating to self-soothe without any connection to weight or body image at the beginning, they eventually end up getting drawn into the vortex of diet culture because it's basically impossible not to in our society. And when that happens, people start having restrictive and self-judgmental thoughts in response to the comfort eating, and often restrictive behaviors as well. So then suddenly there's mental and physical restriction, which create the conditions for binging, as I've talked about a lot on the podcast. So you get into the restrict binge cycle, or what I often call the restriction pendulum, where restriction swings, you have the sort of pull of the pendulum over to the side of restriction, and then it swings back to binging over and over again. And you might initially pull the pendulum over because you feel like it was already swinging over to the side of binging, but then, you're pulling it to the side of restriction repeatedly. So of course it's going to keep swinging, and it's not just going to settle in the middle peacefully. So what started out as just a coping strategy for emotions, like eating in the face of anxiety, for example, becomes entangled in diet culture thinking too. And binging can definitely be both of these things, a coping strategy and a response to diet culture. And the same goes for people who stumble into restriction or compensatory behaviors, by the way, like stumbling into those as a means of self-soothing. If the restriction or compensating leads to some short-term weight loss, as restrictive eating behaviors often do in the short run, and of course, not in the long run, as we've discussed here many times, people often notice that the short-term weight loss gets complimented, right? And we live in diet culture where thinness is celebrated. So people are going to notice whatever weight loss you might experience in the short term. And suddenly this behavior that started as a mechanism of self-soothing is now also wrapped up in diet culture too, in the desire to maintain your weight loss or keep losing weight or get the praise that you've been getting from people for losing weight. And so it sounds like for you who asked the question, Kate, the cultural factors did play a role, and maybe more so in the past for you, like when you were 17, 18 and first started struggling with anorexia, since it sounds like it really did help you to understand the cultural issues and get pissed about them and start pushing back against diet culture. But now it sounds like there's something that still pops up every once in a while when you're anxious, like you go back to the old coping mechanism of eating, and it doesn't have as much to do at this point with overt concerns about your body. But I would still invite you to look at what you're saying to yourself in those moments when you end up binging. Are you judging yourself and telling yourself you quote unquote shouldn't be doing this anymore? You really should be beyond this? Or are you saying that it's bad? Or are there thoughts about how you need to restrict or compensate for the eating that you've been doing in those moments? And you did say that there are occasional moments when you'll be eating something and feel like it's bad and judge yourself for that. And so end up binging as a result. And that's not the most common trigger for binging, but it is an occasional trigger for binging for you, which tells me that the diet mentality maybe the internalized version of diet culture in your mind is still hanging on for you in some ways. So I bet that there are some thoughts going on in your head judging you for binging, judging you for eating as a self-soothing mechanism. And all of that can really perpetuate the behavior. Shame about your eating habits or shame about your body size has actually been shown to make people eat more food, not less. And even calling it binging can sometimes feel pathologizing and judgmental, like making it out to be sort of a really big deal and something scary in your mind. So I wonder if maybe it would help you to reframe those moments as just, I'm eating to self-soothe right now. Oh, look at that. I just ate to self-soothe. I ate because I was anxious. And so basically look at how shaming yourself for the behaviors might be playing a role in perpetuating them. And I would also strongly recommend working with a treatment team. It sounds like you've worked with them in the past, but at this point, at least working with a therapist who is versed in intuitive eating and health at every size, who's not going to reinforce diet culture messages in your mind, but actually help you call them out so that you can get some support around this and help you uncover those last vestiges of diet culture thinking that are hanging on for you. So this is a big part of what I do in my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals, and I really focus on recognizing those subtle ways that the diet mentality is hanging on, because I've found in my clinical practice that everyone I've worked with has those internalized diet culture beliefs that they're not aware of. They have at least some, even if they're really far into recovery or never had a clinical eating disorder, diagnosed eating disorder, even if they're pretty far away from the depths of disordered eating. They still have these internalized messages that they're not aware of, that they're hanging on to, and that are driving any lingering disordered behaviors they have around food. And one of those things that I see all the time is that when people are stressed, they don't eat enough. A lot of times people will go into this low-level restriction, sometimes totally unconsciously and sometimes semi-consciously, and they end up having a rebound binge because they've been deprived. And so they blame the anxiety or whatever the emotion is that's coming up for what they see as their overeating, when actually the low-level restriction was there already because it was caused by the emotion, and that's what triggered the eating. So that's something to consider as well. If you're someone who thinks of yourself as binging in response to emotions, is there actually some inadvertent or semi-conscious restriction happening there in the first place? Because in fact, research shows that if you're not actively dieting, aka restricting your eating all the time or over-exercising or any of those other restrictive behaviors, if you're not actively doing those things, you're much more likely to experience a lower appetite in response to emotions than you are to eat in response to emotions. So people who are intuitive eaters experience this all the time. I've had a lot of people say to me, and this was my experience myself, I used to think of myself as an emotional eater. And now when I'm emotional, I'm actually not hungry because I'm eating enough the rest of the time. That's what an intuitive eater's experience really looks like once you're really far into intuitive eating and you've really practiced it for a while. So it's probably not going to be like that in the beginning, but after you've gone really far into your intuitive eating journey, that's often what it feels like. And so in that sense, binging in response to anxiety either means you actually are restricting more consistently than you think, or that you're not restricting most of the time, but maybe you are unintentionally restricting when you're stressed out, and that eventually results in enough deprivation that you have a rebound swing on the pendulum and end up eating a lot of food at once. So that brings me to this other matter of figuring out, making sure that you are eating enough all the time, that your body is actually getting enough food, that you're no longer restricting, because until your body is reassured that you're not going to go through another famine, the drive to binge is actually a very normal and necessary response. So you have to make sure to address the restriction first. You have to look at the ways that subtle restriction is still holding on in your life and heal that trauma of restriction, because it really is trauma, and your body is naturally going to be on a hair trigger for anything that remotely feels like restriction when you've gone through the level of deprivation that you've gone through. And so once you get to that point of being sure that you're not subtly restricting yourself all the time, and being able to catch yourself when you do have restrictive thoughts or behaviors and rectify that by having more food or having a snack or whatever it is, not delaying your eating, etc., then you can start to look at what is going on in terms of using food to cope with anxiety and start figuring out some coping skills in addition to eating. And I say in addition to and not instead of, because trying to do it instead of eating is just a diet culture move that really shames you for using food as a coping mechanism, and it's going to backfire because you're trying to strip away this thing that has been important to you, that's been helping you, that might exist for very good reason because your body needs it, because your body is not getting enough food the rest of the time. So looking at what are some coping skills you can add in addition to eating, and giving yourself other tools in your toolbox to help you process anxiety. Because if you've been leaning on food as your primary or your only tool for anxiety for a long time, which sounds like maybe you have, you probably need help even thinking of what else is available to you in terms of coping and help developing those skills. So I talked about this in episode 151 with Judith Matz, where we discussed how dealing with emotional eating requires stopping the restrictive behaviors and thoughts first. And then once you've gotten to a place where you're mostly in touch with your body's cues and you're honoring them pretty consistently, then you can start to look at the role that food is playing for you as a coping strategy. But again, you don't want to rush this process because you do need time to make sure that you've fully given up dieting, you've fully given up those subtle levels of restriction that might be holding on for you, that I'm sure are holding on for you, honestly, and give yourself time to recover from that first before you start looking at the emotional uses of food. So you can check out that episode with Judith for more at christyharrison.com/151, or just look for Food Psych episode 151 wherever you get your podcasts. And it might be worth reaching out to Judith and seeing if she's taking new clients, that she might be a helpful person to work through this with. And so just to sum up, I want to say that hopefully this answer makes it clear that diet culture isn't just the diet industry or the beauty industry or something to blame externally. It's actually all the beliefs about food and weight and quote unquote overeating that we've internalized over the years. So diet culture is internalized beliefs that we carry around with us. It's not something, they are from outside and we need to get them back outside of us because they don't actually belong to us, but we carry them around in us. And it's a lot more than just the diet industry or marketing or media. It's all of it. It's the accumulation of everything anybody's ever said to you about your weight or about weight in general, or every fat phobic comment you've ever heard in your life, every little moment that someone makes fun of, a character makes fun of another character's weight on TV, all of it adds up. As David Foster Wallace said, culture is the water we're swimming in, right? And so in Western society, diet culture is the water we're swimming in. We're steeped in it everywhere we go. So even if your disordered eating initially had more to do with your individual mental health, you can be sure that diet culture is afoot somewhere in the mix. It's the water we're swimming in. You're saturated with it. And so I'd invite you to look for the subtle ways that it's showing up in your relationship with food, even as you work to address whatever individual mental health role that food is playing for you. So I hope that was helpful. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want a whole huge library of answers like this and the chance to ask me as many questions as you want to help you get rid of those sneaky manifestations of diet culture, come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. It's really a group coaching program with lots of peer support as well as some individual support in the form of those Q&As, because breaking free from diet culture can be so tricky, and it's really important to have community in this process because, like I said, it's the water that we're all swimming in, so it's hard to escape and it's hard to notice, and your peers in your community can help you point out the ways that you might be holding on to diet culture. So if you're ready to become an intuitive eater and get rid of all those sneaky forms of diet culture that you've internalized, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Heidi Schauster. So Heidi, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad to have you here again.
I am so happy to be back. Thank you for having me, Christy, so much.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And the last episode we were on together, our first episode together, was episode 107, which was about a year and a half ago. So a lot can happen in a year and a half, and I know a lot has happened for you. So why don't you catch us up on everything you've been up to since then?
Wow, yeah, a year and a half. Has it really been a year and a half? Well, I mean, as you know, I have published a book this past year called Nourish, and the subtitle is How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body, and Self. And it's was a journey, as you know, because you're in the middle of writing a book, to put it together and put it out there in the world. And now to sort of see how it's doing its thing out in the world, like to have response from people who are reading it, to have people reviewing it. And it's exciting to sort of have it percolating out there. It's wild.
I know, I bet. It must be really fascinating. We were talking a little bit off mic earlier about how it's like another child, like you've raised and created this thing, you're putting it out into the world and seeing what it does, like your baby.
Yeah, it definitely feels a little bit like a third child on some level. And it's interesting. It's that, and I except I'm sort of pushed it out into the world, at this point. And it's like, okay, do your thing. And yeah, it's been exciting to have the response from people who are reading it and really having pieces of it resonate so much with their own experience, and to have people write to me and say how much it's helping them on their journey. It helps remind me like, oh yes, this is why I had all the blood, sweat, and tears to try to put this out into the world. It's actually out there helping people. I live in this really privileged area where so many people can get help for their disordered eating struggles, and it's not everywhere. And so like the idea that there are people who maybe don't have as many resources who are actually reading it, and even those that do say have their own, team of people that they're working with to heal their relationship with food, like even those people to have it as an adjunct and to be using it, it's very humbling and exciting. And it's like, yes, this is why it wanted me to write it.
Yeah. Tell me about how that process began, because I don't know if you were even working on the book yet. I don't know if you'd had the idea and were getting started back when we first talked, because I think I'm actually remembering like the episode aired about 1.5 years ago, but I think we recorded it, because I'm usually so far ahead, I think we recorded it even several months before that. So it's been like, maybe by the time this comes out, close to 2 years since we actually had our last interview. So what was it? What gave you the sort of germ of the idea for the book? What made you decide to write it and got you motivated to do it at that point in your life?
Well, it's interesting. It definitely was a journey. I started writing pieces of the book probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I started with blog posts, and some of that content was refigured, and some of the ideas were refigured for the book. And I definitely started writing pieces of it, and I would like write it in really interesting little spurts. Like, okay, this feels like something that wants to be written. And then I'd write a piece of it. And then I'd be like, okay, this feels like something that wants to be written. And I always thought maybe at some point I'd put it into a book, and, friends and colleagues would say, when are you going to write your book? And I would laugh. Oh yeah, maybe when my kids go to college. But I finally I don't know what it was. It was just this moment of like, all right, I feel like I'm going to burst. It just needs to be written. And I don't actually even know if I can remember when that moment happened. I know that the whole process of like really getting serious and like nose to the grindstone about writing it was it was about 1 year, but I had kind of put pieces of it together. And then I just finally decided, no, it just really wants to be written. And I don't know why it wants to be written right now, because this is maybe not the best time, but it just wants to. And it was sort of like a creative volcano that just needed to erupt. And so I started, and I got some help with others who were like trying to write their first book. And that was immensely helpful, especially connecting with one woman who was in North Carolina who was doing the same thing. And we just kind of like cheered each other on the whole time. And then it just unfolded. So I don't even know if I can remember the exact moment when I decided it's just time, but I know like the feeling. And it was almost like a spiritual moment, to sound a little woo-woo about it. But it was like, okay, it's time. It's no longer something I can deny. It's not really me writing this book. It's like the book writing itself. And I'm just going to be the vehicle. That's what it felt like.
Yeah, I can very much identify with that, actually, both with my own book and with my online course, which that was probably 3 years ago that I started working on the online course. And that was very much, and I wonder if this was was the case for you too. But the online course for me was born out of doing a lot of one-on-one work with clients and kind of talking about the same things over and over again and having these conversations where I was like, oh, here's my piece about this. Here's my, sort of noticing like that I was framing things in a similar way from person to person, that all these people were coming in with the same sorts of questions. And I was coming up with like things that resonated, and sort of testing them out with different clients and then finding what really connected with people, what people were able to sort of understand and grasp and that felt like it moved them forward. And then repeating that and using that and seeing it work with other people and being like, okay, so this is my thing now. This is like how I talk about this topic. And how cool would it be to write this down or to put this in a multimedia format and like get to reach lots more people than I'm ever able to reach one-on-one. And I also had a waiting list, and I also was just like kind of getting burnt out on the one-on-one work. So I was like, the next thing needs to happen. But it was a time when I was very busy in my private practice and with the podcast and like juggling a lot in my life. And it was not the right time. I mean, it ended up being the right time, but it was like I was killing myself to get this done, and I imposed a deadline on myself that was kind of unrealistic, but it was because I just felt like I have to do this so that this can be out there and so that my next phase of professional life can unfold.
Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. And it's almost like when we have those moments where we feel a little bit either burnt out or stale or whatever, it's that creative spark that just comes. And it's like, okay, well, this is something different that I could do. And there's like excitement behind it, and then if it can help people, then that feels there's even more of a stronger drive behind it besides that little creative spark. So yeah, it was like on many levels, it just was time. And, if I think that if I had actually known what it would take, I was so naive going into this, to writing a book. I was like, oh yeah, writing a book. People do this all the time. But I think if I had known what it was really going to be like, I might not have done it. So I'm really glad I went in naive. And I'm so grateful that I got through the process. I think it was really growth inducing for me. And it was, as you know, this book is it's a collection of techniques that I use in my own practice that I've found to be really helpful over the 20 years that I've been doing this work. But it's also personal. It also like draws from lots of different areas of my own life. So it's really a piece of vulnerability to kind of put it out there in the world. And it felt important on so many different levels. And so the fact that people are reading it and resonating with it and appreciating some of the things I spent a lot of time being very meticulous about around it, like that just makes me so happy.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about what some of those things are, because you have this structure to it that definitely reminds me of the structure of intuitive eating or of similar books where there's sort of like a step-by-step, and you talk about how they're not concrete steps really, but this kind of progression, this systematic working through of different issues. And I'm curious to hear what those steps are and why you frame them the way you did or put them in the order you did.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and as you said, they're not linear steps in any way. And I say that throughout the book, just because body acceptance, I call it body acceptance, if not love, is step 2. Doesn't mean that you're like, once you're done with working on body acceptance, you're done and you're going to move on. It means that you're probably going to circle back and need to do work on that over and over again throughout the journey. So even though I've listed them as steps, I've definitely stressed that they're not linear and they're often revisited. But I did start with some of the steps that I think are kind of foundational and kind of concrete if someone is working on their healing around food and their body, which is, as you know, stuff you talk about all the time in the podcast, letting go of dieting, working on body acceptance, if not love, and doing awareness work. That's like sort of step 3, which is actually paying attention to your own habits around food, for example, before you actually even try to change them. In fact, I think I've found, and you probably found in your own work, that when people try to jump into change so fast, it often backfires. It's really important to sort of pay attention and slow down and listen before jumping into any kind of change work. And as you know, these are steps that are not just like my own creation. They like, I take from mindfulness work, I take from intuitive eating, I take from a little bit of motivational interviewing, work. I mean, I take from IFS type structures and acceptance and commitment therapy. So they're kind of an amalgamation of different techniques that I found that are helpful and ways of looking at this process that are helpful.
Absolutely. I'm curious to hear your idea of awareness a little more specifically and why it's so important, because I think that in the podcast and in my work, my public work, I guess, I do a lot of kind of laying the groundwork of like, what are the ideas, rejecting the diet mentality, exposing diet culture. And I mean, this gets into like a whole other layer here, but I feel like for me, speaking publicly, I almost don't want to speak publicly about some of the much later principles of intuitive eating, like gentle nutrition specifically, and also sometimes movement, depending on where a person is in their relationship with movement. It's like so hard to know where people are at in their own journey. So I tend to stay with the principles that like everybody can do, even if they're sort of early on, where it's not getting too advanced and where you don't have to have all the other foundations kind of set in order to approach those final principles without falling back into the diet mentality. And so I think I do a lot of education around like what diet culture is and what we're aiming for in a balanced relationship with food. But I find that sometimes when people are coming to me, when they're coming into my online course or when they're coming to work with me one-on-one, they're like wanting to already be there, feeling like they have to be doing this because they've been hearing me and my guests talk about it on the podcast, and they've been reading about intuitive eating in all these places, and the sort of general drumbeat of like, we got to get rid of the diet mentality, you got to do this, this, and this, the sort of things that we talk about publicly, they feel like they should already be doing. And I think it's so different to hear about it and intellectually understand it versus to actually put it into practice in your life. And so to me, like self-compassion is so foundational there in terms of having compassion for yourself that you're not already there yet and not expecting that of yourself.
Absolutely.
But that awareness piece, I think, is really important too. And I'd love to hear you talk about what are some of the ways people can start to be aware without judgment, without pushing themselves, without feeling like they should already be there right now.
Yeah, I think that non-judgmental place is so important. I mean, I've heard you use the term curiosity, not criticism, right? We all use that in our work, like to actually take a look at our own practices that we have, our own habits around food and movement and self-care. And without judgment, just notice what's there and notice like what feels good and notice what doesn't feel so good. Not from a should kind of place or like this health guru said that this is what I should be doing kind of place, but more of these are some of the habits I've fallen into in my life. And these are the things I tend to give a lot of time to. And these are things I don't really want to be putting as much time into. And just to actually notice that it's so hard to do it without judgment, but without judgment, just kind of noticing like, this is what my life looks like on a daily basis. And what would I like to do differently in a more kind of goal-directed and soul-directed way, as opposed to a critic, or a judgmental kind of way, which is where we often go when we look at our own habits, things that we don't like about ourselves, for example.
I know, it's so hard. It's so hard not to do that, right? To be like, here's what I want instead, and not to just immediately berate yourself for not having that yet, or be like so impatient to get there.
Right. And I feel like these like preliminary steps are so important. One of the big reasons that I wrote this book, I guess I should have mentioned this earlier, but when you asked me, but so many people, when they find out, the work that I do, will say, oh, can you recommend like a good basic nutrition book? And I will say, not easily, because there aren't a whole lot of like most books that focus on diet and nutrition are really diet oriented. And one of my struggles was to try to create a book that someone who might be in recovery from an eating disorder could read, but also someone who is not in recovery from an eating disorder, but just wants some like kind of how to eat help, but ends up going into the book with I want to find out more about how to eat, but then comes out of it like, wow, I Someone's not telling me how to do it. Someone's actually giving me some suggestions for how to work with myself and my own awareness and my own listening to figure that out for myself. That was sort of my task.
And that's really hard, right? Because nutrition books are so, like you said, steeped in diet culture. And nutrition itself is so steeped in diet culture. I think it's really hard to teach nutrition in a way that's stripped of those diet culture-y things. Like there's definitely foundations and principles of nutrition that are helpful and that people can use to, further their own self-care along with connecting with their bodies and listening to their body's wisdom. It's not like this top-down approach that it is in diet culture's nutrition. But I think that is such a difficult thing to navigate for anyone who's really stuck in diet culture.
Yeah. And like for me in writing this book, it was like I was struggling with, how much do I put in about food? And I'm like, well, I have to put some things about food because this is like people are coming here wanting to get some sense of how to find some balance in their life with food. But to be able to do that in a way that, is ideally not triggering. I mean, I had to do a lot of editing and having professionals and clients read versions to just make sure that nothing felt triggering. It's so hard to write about food and not be triggered or not be triggering anyone, even like designing the cover and not putting food on it on purpose. I mean, although I do have a mint leaf on it, but that's not, I think that's a pretty untriggering image. And so I think it's tricky to try to sort of give people, and I call it nutritional common sense, without telling them what to eat. Because absolutely, I don't have the wisdom of what's ideal for them to eat in any given moment. They do. And so teaching people how to go back to that listening that we were able to do so seamlessly, most of us at least when we were toddlers, but seem to have lost over the years that diet culture has kind of seeped in. I think being able to build that skill back, it's a challenge. And I'm trying to give people a bit of a roadmap for that in this book.
Yeah. And I want to get into that a little bit because really we haven't talked a lot about gentle nutrition on the podcast. We've talked about nutrition in various ways, but often to kind of break down what diet culture says. But I don't talk a lot about the sort of flip side of it, of how nutrition can actually work for you. I think because I've said this on the show before, I'm a nutritionist and I don't actually care that much about nutrition. I really am not so interested in nutrition as I am in people's relationships with food and helping them heal their relationships with food. And I feel like the nutrition part, yes, there's a place for that. And I certainly help people with that when they've done the work on the other parts of healing their relationship with food. But I think it's like the healing of diet culture's messages, the breaking free from diet culture is such a tall order that it's very far down the line usually that we get to nutrition. But I think that there probably are some folks listening who are ready to approach and integrate nutrition back into their lives. There are also some folks listening who are in an eating disorder right now and really struggling and wanting that sort of bridge, I think, from the eating disorder mindset to, okay, but what does nutrition look like when I'm recovered? What can I expect nutrition to be for me down the line? And then folks maybe who've just stumbled in here and are like, oh, I didn't think I had a bad relationship with food, and actually I'm realizing I kind of do. And what can I do now to be healthy or in balance or whatever? So I think it might be good to have some guidance around what does gentle nutrition even mean and what does it look like?
Yeah, no, great. That's such a great question. And I think I guess I'm not as interested in nutrition these days either. That's why I use the word nourish as the title of the book. I mean, I think of nourishment as more what I'm helping my clients to strive for as opposed to nutrition. Because nutrition has, I don't know, I guess there's the connotation for me that nutrition is somehow like whether or not I'm eating healthy. And I think that's just what our society puts on it, actually. But to me, nourishment is like, am I taking in food on a regular basis that actually is sustaining me, that is giving me the energy and vitality that I want to be able to do the kinds of things in the world that I want to do. And that's going to be different for different people. We all need different levels of energy based on our temperaments and our activity levels and all kinds of things. So it's really like discovering, both the amount of food and the types of food that really feel good, that feel vital, and that actually allow us to not have to think about it too much, but go through our day and do the things that we're called to do on this planet. And so we have to do, I always tell my clients, like, you can't just intuitive eating is not about just not thinking about food at all and just, oh, this is what I want and I'm just going to have it. And I think, sometimes it gets interpreted that way. My sense is that intuitive eating, gentle nutrition, or nutritional common sense, if you want to use my term, is really about some kind of planning. Like, if I'm only going to have a half-hour lunch, through a long day, and that's my only break, I'm going to need to actually plan for some food during that time. And I'm going to want to plan for some food that's actually going to help me get through my afternoon and be able to focus. And so I'm going to do, ideally, if I'm on this process, I'm going to do the investigative work to figure out what that is. And that might take some experimentation. And then I'm going to have to actually execute that meal, whether it's in the morning or the night before or whatever, and kind of plan and pack it up and bring it to work with me. And that does actually require some planning and some thought and some attention, but not too much attention. It's not like an obsessive kind of like, oh my gosh, if I don't eat the perfect lunch, then I'm going to have a really bad, interview in the afternoon. It's more like, can we approach it with like, how can I take the best care of myself today as I'm going into this really long work day? How can I take the very best care of myself with food? And it becomes kind of an act of nurturing ourselves if we use food in that way. And it's a very different relationship with food than trying to, quote unquote, get it right. And that's, I think, how so many of us approach nutrition, for better, for worse. We're kind of taught that way, that it's about getting it right. But it's not really about that. It's really about, in the moment, can we take good care of ourselves? And in choosing food, we actually have this amazing ritual, and it can be just that. But it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to feel caregiving, so to speak, in order for it to feel balanced, I think.
Right. And I'm really struck by I forget who it was, but there's a psychologist who has the concept of the good enough parent. Maybe it's like Erickson or something, maybe. Someone listening will probably know, but it's this idea that the parents don't have to be perfect to be good caregivers. They just have to be good enough. And they're gonna make lots of mistakes, and they're gonna fuck up their kids in certain ways and whatever. But if they're good enough parents, they're gonna give them sort of a baseline of functioning in the world that will serve them.
Yeah, that intention is so important. It's really all about intention. And actually, in the process of raising a couple daughters who are now teens, they feel that intention. So even if you do screw up and you say something that you didn't mean, it's okay, especially if your intention is there, and if you're also capable of owning it and apologizing, for example. They really feel you striving to be the best parent that you can be, even if you're struggling through it, which we all do. And I think it's kind of like that with food. You're right. I think the intention that we approach our meals, when we're at that countertop and we're fixing ourselves our lunch, are we doing it with this sort of hurried sense of, I better get it perfect? Or are we actually caring for ourselves? Like, this is my little self-care moment of the day where I'm going to make sure that I make that sandwich, just the way I like it, and add a little extra zing or flavor here and there, because this will actually make me feel good. So it's a very different approach.
And it incorporates pleasure, like you said, making it something that you enjoy eating. And it also incorporates enough. Like, I've actually started talking a lot, and I have a section in my book about the concept of enough, where that was actually the working title. I've discovered it is not now going to be the final title. I'll be able to announce the final title soon, but it's very much a theme throughout the book, is this concept of enough. And it doesn't mean like just enough or you're going to be too much. It's more like we're always in this mentality of scarcity in diet culture. We're in this mentality of deprivation. And so allowing ourselves to have enough and abundance and as much as we want, this idea, I think that you're talking about too, in terms of nourishing yourself and having, the common sense nutrition include, like, I need to have enough to get me through this day. I need to have enough to be satisfied through my meeting. And I also need to probably pack a snack because I'm going to need something in the afternoon, just like this kind of idea of providing for yourself.
Totally. I know in my own recovery that a sense of abundance was particularly important. Like, I needed to feel that food was not going to be scarce in any way. And so I became the person who always had the good snacks in her bag. I to this day, I'm like, I tend to be someone who is really planful about making sure that I have food around me if I'm not going to have breaks. And I do that as like an act of self-care, and it doesn't require a whole lot of thought or energy anymore because it's like a little automatic. But like creating a sense of abundance, that was particularly important for me. And it's been important for a lot of my clients as well. That sense that like everything that I need is here. And actually, I think the universe kind of works like that, too, if we want to get really like on a spiritual plane about it. But everything we need is really here. And we just need to access it and trust that we will have everything that we need. And there's, when it comes to food, there is a little bit of work that needs to be done in order to make that possible. Like that you can't feel abundance around food if you don't get to the grocery store with some regularity, for example. So there are practical pieces to it. But that is a huge and helpful intention often to create abundance around food, as opposed to diet scarcity.
Right. Diet scarcity, or like the scarcity of food insecurity. That's another trauma that I think a lot of people face. Like, I've had a number of clients who've had this sort of double whammy of growing up with food scarcity and then developing an eating disorder and having that be very tied up with diet culture and beliefs about their body size. So it's like so much to untangle those two things, because not only it's two layers and two levels of this kind of scarcity and deprivation mindset that really creates trauma for people around food. And I think that sense of like, to the extent that you can now, to the extent that you are, and some people are still struggling with food security now. So I think that becomes tougher. But like, to the extent that you're able to create some sense of safety and abundance for yourself around food, that is going to be the path to healing.
Yeah. And it can be scary for people to do that when they believe that abundance means that they don't have control. I mean, obviously that's a myth that you're out of control. You're not. But there's often that belief there that gets in the way.
And I see that even with people who consider themselves binge eaters or have binge eating disorder, like where they see themselves as eating too much. So how could it be about scarcity or deprivation? Because I'm clearly eating too much. And I think that's a really tricky way that diet culture twists itself, because actually binging is about deprivation, is about lack, is about scarcity. There's an underlying sense of scarcity and deprivation that's creating the conditions for a binge. And so It's not that you're lacking willpower or something. It's actually that you do need enough. You need more than enough. You need abundance.
Right. And that sense of scarcity can be real experienced scarcity, but it can also be, it kind of brings up a sense of deprivation in the mind. That's not just about food scarcity or dieting. It can also just be about deprivation in general. It can bring up feelings of like neglect that maybe are in someone's past, for example. So there's so many different layers. Food becomes a layered bit of work to sort of unravel all of that. But I do think that there's a way to talk about food and talk about the nitty-gritty of like creating some structure from chaotic eating, for example, without it becoming rigid or without it becoming perfect or without it having to be very black and white, which is unfortunately where most people go when they read a lot of the sort of health-oriented bits of nutrition that are out there. It's very black and white. But I think there's a lot, we can work in a way that isn't like that. It's just a little more challenging because it's very different than what's out there around nutrition.
It really is. And what do you think are some of the ways that people can create that structure for themselves without falling into rigidity?
I think it kind of depends on the individual. Sometimes people, for example, a very common food pattern, like food habit that people get into at times is not eating. It's very American, not eating very much during the day because there's so much work to be done. And then by the time the day's out, they are ravenous and they don't understand why they can have like a good solid dinner, but still find themselves foraging at night. I mean, this is a very common scenario, for example, but sometimes it just takes some planning, really takes some planning and thought to move some food into someone's day. And it doesn't even matter like so much what kind of food it is. Honestly, it's more really about there's obviously, it helps to have some balance in terms of the macronutrients. And, that's some education that can be done. But the bottom line is getting some more food energy, some more sort of vital fuel in the earlier parts of the day often turns around this pattern that feels really chaotic in the evening. And that's so basic, but it's actually can be really life-changing for people to actually just make that little adjustment. And that to me is some gentle nutrition, if you want to use the intuitive eating term. It's like just really working from that, like taking a look at the day and finding the places where maybe someone isn't getting enough nourishment, and then trying to sort of move food into those places as, again, little self-care rituals.
I've seen that be really effective for people too. And yeah, that's sort of like transformational experience of, oh my God, I don't feel totally out of control and obsessed anymore now. When I get home from work, I feel like I can have dinner and then a while later have dessert and then not be like binging all night.
Right. And lo and behold, they feel more focused during the day too, and more energy. And that's like, oh, I didn't even realize that I could feel better.
Right. It sort of feeds on itself that way too, I think, because when people feel better, it reinforces the new behaviors of like, oh, see, I guess I wasn't eating enough because I now feel so much better.
Mm-hmm. Movement is sort of the same thing. And I specifically call my chapter 6 or step 6 conscious, joyful movement and not exercise, because exercise has such a lot of negative connotations for so many of my clients. But like trying to also work with figuring out what forms of movement, and I mean movement in the purest sense, like work with my body, my ability, my day, what actually helps support me throughout the day. And it's a very different way of looking at physical activity than, say, the traditional fitness industry might look at it. But to actually create, self-care practices around movement as well. So again, it feels like this is one of the ways that I take care of myself, as opposed to, oh, I need to get to the gym.
Right. I have to do this. Yeah, exactly. Or I have to do this to earn my food, or I have to do this to work off my food or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, that sort of compensatory mindset is really problematic when it comes to movement. But I think also in terms of food, it's interesting. I just was thinking how, in terms of the structure of it, people, I think, often in diet culture get scared of certain macronutrients. Specifically, in this day and age, it tends to be carbs in various forms of carbs, like sugar. And, they just get so panicked about that stuff that they end up not eating enough of that. And I think the structure, again, of like learning to bring back in balanced meals where it's like, oh no, you do need to have bread on your sandwich, or you do need to have rice with your sesame chicken or whatever it is. Like you do actually need that carb, that nutrient in your meal in order to make you feel satisfied, in order to feel like you've had enough. And so giving that sense of abundance again by breaking down some of these diet rules.
Absolutely. I don't think I've ever found anyone who, like, I've done the carb experiment with who's ever wanted to go back. I call it the carb experiment because I'll say, like, okay, for just 1 week, or maybe I'll say 2 weeks, let's just try to add back a little bit more carbohydrate in your life. And we kind of pick a few areas where they could add it back, and like, just try it. Just see how you feel. Like if it's not working for you, you can go back, But it almost always, people come back to me and they're like, wow, I actually feel better when I'm at work. Like I'm not thinking about food all day. And it's almost like miraculous. Our bodies aren't meant to cut out whole food groups. It's like, and back when I started practicing in the 90s, it was all fat. Like everybody was afraid of fat. And I have this like handout about all the real benefits of fat, which I don't even give out anymore because nobody's afraid of fat anymore, but it's definitely carbohydrates. And so I spend a lot of time talking about carbohydrates these days and how important it is. I mean, anyone who's exercising regularly, anyone who's really wants to move their muscles on a regular basis is going to deplete their glycogen stores and feel lousy if they're not getting enough carbohydrates. So like that's something basic that we can talk about. And sometimes those are like the strategies, those small but really hard to surmount for a lot of people, strategies that actually make a difference and make people feel better.
Yeah. And I think sometimes they just need permission with those things. Like I've found that a lot of people know in their bones that having enough carbohydrates at a meal feels better and that they felt pretty much fine growing up with food, if they had a decent relationship with food at some point in their history that they can remember, which not everybody does. But for those who do, it's like if you were eating sort of a regular meal pattern as a kid, pretty much every cuisine around the world. I often tell people this when I'm talking about gentle nutrition, like every cuisine around the world has kind of the same building blocks in its meals and even in its snacks too. It's like snacks are usually something with like carbs, like a sweet type of thing, maybe a little bit of protein, some fat, but like the meals are protein, carb, fat, veggies, fruits, some kind of oil or sauce, and fats are in there very much. But carbs are also very, very central. It's like that's kind of the staple of the plate for most cuisines around the world. And I think when people grow up eating whatever cuisine they grow up with, they get those building blocks given to them if they have a family that has a balanced relationship with food. And that's something they can go back to and recognize like, oh yeah, that was fine. Like I was fine eating that way versus feeling totally rattled and bananas around food all the time because they're trying to cut out a whole food group.
Right. Yeah. And carbohydrates are so grounding too. Like when someone feels like their anxiety is through the roof, they're just like floating up above their life. It's amazing how sometimes just a little carbohydrate will just bring them right down to earth a little bit. So it's interesting to watch that happen. So it's like, you're right. Like we instinctively learn growing up, how to eat. If we had the opportunity in our homes to have some balanced nutrition and, just going back to that, like that sense of being able to self-select food and eat a balanced diet without having to really think about it is possible. It's just like you almost have to unlearn some of those patterns of restriction that come in from diet culture.
Right. And you can unlearn them at any point. I think it's so amazing to see even people who didn't grow up with a good model of how to relate to food, like who grew up with a really disordered family or a lot of weight bias in the family that made their family restrict their eating, even if they didn't restrict everybody else in the family's eating. Those folks can still, at adulthood, make peace with food and learn a much more balanced approach to food. It's not something you have to necessarily learn just at one point in your life. You had a part in the book that I really liked talking about these kids that you worked with who had a period of tube feeding while they were babies and toddlers and like kind of missed the window for learning how to even appreciate food and sort of understand food from a sensory perspective. Like having food in their mouths was really foreign to them. And I don't know, your description of how they were able to transform was really, really cool and really instructive, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they were able to find some pleasure in taste for the very first time, but they had some steps to go through to get over the trauma of the sensory kind of trauma that was food in their mouth, which was just, they had missed all their feeding cues, so they didn't really understand what was going on. So it took some time. And I kind of think of like recovery from, funky eating or eating disorders on any end of the continuum as sort of like that in some ways. Like we have to kind of go through a bit of a process to kind of unpackage some of what got us here to begin with. And then the goal, as I see it, is to sort of develop a style of eating that's really connected to ourselves, not what somebody on the internet tells us we should be eating, and not what some nutritionist tells us we should be eating. I always say, like, if there's a nutritionist that's telling you what to eat, beware.
Yep. Fire them.
Beware.
Yeah.
If somebody has a frank eating disorder and needs the structure of some meal planning, like that's different.
Right.
But what I'm talking about is like someone saying like, I know your body better than you know your body, and this is how you should eat. And I think everyone should do this, that, or the other thing. I worry about that approach. I think the goal, at least in my work, and I'm certain it's in your work too, Christy's, is really helping people to connect with themselves, figure out what are the ways of eating that really nourish you, and also connect with your values and the things that you enjoy, that you find pleasure in, and that sustain you throughout a day. And then incorporating that and noticing then what works and what doesn't work. And always coming back to that sense of I'm taking care of myself with food.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a different mindset. And probably maybe for some folks listening, it's confusing because it is so advanced as an intuitive eating practice, like to be at this place of self-care through food, because diet culture in its modern guise as the wellness diet, as I call it, it's all about fake self-care, basically. It's like,
right.
The wellness diet tells you you're doing self-care, but you're actually doing diet culture. And it is an unlearning, like you said, you have to unlearn the wellness diet. You have to unlearn diet culture's fake ways of self-care in order to come to like a true self-care that is grounded in your own relationship with your body, your own exploration and understanding of what is nourishing and satisfying to you without all that noise of like, oh, but gluten's going to make you feel bad. And then you're like, oh my God, I think gluten makes me feel bad. And is that coming from you or is that coming from diet culture? Like you have to tease out that stuff first before you can get to a point of recognizing like, this is what I actually enjoy eating.
Right. And you're right. It's work that's further along in the process. It's not something that's so easy to do when your hunger and fullness cues, for example, are really off because you're recovering from an eating disorder in the early stages. It's not easy to do when you're still really steeped in diet culture and like there's a lot going on in your head that is saying black and white around food. Like you have to kind of work through that first. But I think to get to and also there's this mindfulness, like embodiment kind of work that we haven't even really talked about, where if you're really disconnected from your body, it's so hard to actually access that wisdom that the body has for feeding itself. So it's like actually working on reconnecting with the body. And that's where I think body acceptance is so important, because why would you want to connect with your body if you don't like it? But to actually really honor your body and what it's telling you it wants, you're like, wow, like my body actually is really interested in this crusty bread that's in front of me. Like that's really different than like the voice that's saying, don't eat it, it's got gluten, like to really like actually listen to the wisdom of the body. You have to be connected to it and want to listen to it. And that's challenging. Like you said, it's an advanced work if you're on the journey.
Yes, very advanced and yeah, because there's so much that gets in the way. Our default mode is intuitive eating, as I always say. That's like the factory setting, other than the people who like those babies and toddlers who end up having to be tube fed because of some digestive problem that they have or something like that. Even out the gate, those kids were probably still programmed to eat intuitively, before that happened. Like everybody, we all have the capacity to eat intuitively. And it's like, I guess the metaphor of like factory settings is kind of a good one, because if you think about an iPhone that you've jailbroken and put a lot of weird pirated software onto, like, that's going to mess things up. That's going to really destabilize your operating system or whatever. I don't know. Like I'm kind of making up terms, but maybe programmers
I like the metaphor.
will know what I'm talking about. Yeah. But it's like, if you get it back to the factory settings that it was designed to have and then put the software on that it is meant to have, that's a whole different story. It's going to be in a much better condition. And I think in a lot of ways we are similar to that iPhone, where like in diet culture, we've all been jailbroken, AKA brainwashed by these messages that we've gotten from toddlerhood, really, like since we could talk. We have things like, someone was telling me on the podcast recently, like Peppa Pig, which is a children's show that's popular now, has like all kinds of fat phobia, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me really sad, but I have to say that like some of my favorite work is when I see people really seeing that all for what it is and getting messages from those around them, for example, that are right there and could easily trigger them, and they're recognizing them for what it is, what they are, and just saying, I'm not going there, and taking good care of themselves anyway. And then when the thing that's great about kind of healing your relationship with food too is that then food doesn't have to be such a big deal. Like you said, nutrition stops being so interesting, and all the other things in life, kind of flourish more when food just kind of takes its place. Like, it's nourishing and it's like important. You have to do it several times a day, and there's some planning involved, but it's just one of the ways that you take care of yourself. And, and sometimes people have to work on the part of them that like doesn't believe they deserve self-care. And that's another part. That's another enoughness too. This sense of like, yes, I am enough and I do deserve like to take good care of myself, and I don't have to do everything. I can stop and nourish myself on whatever level I need to be nourished. That's a part of the work too. But it's so wonderful to see people starting to do that and like their lives just blossoming because their obsession with food and their bodies and with feeling awful all the time just dissolves over time. And their lives are more. They're more.
And almost more rooted than they were before, even sometimes. I was just talking about this with someone in my online course where she was like, I'm now at a point where I can hear coworkers talking about the Whole30 and not feel like asking them what that's about or how to do it or what it was like for them or whatever, just to kind of be like, okay, moving on. That's too bad for you, kind of silently in her head, and like, and then go on to something much more interesting. And that is such a gift that we have, like to be able to help people come around to this place where they don't have to because I think that in diet culture, we all sort of live on this disordered spectrum from such a young age, so that even if we're not actively engaging in disordered behaviors or maybe very low-grade disordered behaviors, we all have the disordered thoughts. Like, we all have some disordered thoughts around food. And I think once you go through the process of healing a relationship with food because you've been pushed to the point of needing to do that, then you come out the other side with a much more resilient attitude and a much better ability to sort of avoid and weather the storm of those things where you're not low level triggered all the time.
Absolutely. It's a blessing of recovery, really, of having to go through this work and coming out the other end, is that, you're much more able to see clearly those messages and just say, oh, I'm really sorry that my coworkers are engaging in that. Like, I have better things to do. Not in a judgy way, because, that's never the way I would want to approach it, but more in a like, oh, like, I'm so glad that I'm taking care of myself differently.
And there might be, a period of judginess. I think that's a lot of people go through that too, of like being angry when they see diet culture and being angry at the purveyors of diet culture around them. And that's so understandable because it is frustrating. It is
part of the journey. Yeah. Totally.
But then at a certain point, you can get to a place where you're just like, ugh, that again, and you see it pop up and you recognize it for what it is quickly, and then you move on.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that my, life is such that I don't get stuck in that anymore, to be able to say that, like, oh, I'm so grateful that I'm not going down that rabbit hole right now. So,
me too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's wonderful to see people move through that process. So that's ultimately what I was trying to do with these steps, is kind of like help people work through that journey. And some of it's about food, some of it's about movement, some of it's about actually creating other sustaining self-care practices that aren't food related, but that help you nourish yourself. And then moving through that process over and over again until you're actually in a place where you feel a little bit more balanced in your relationship with food. Because we have to have a relationship with food.
Yeah.
As you know, like, we can't get through the day without it. To find a way for it to like have its place and not have to be so all-consuming, but to actually have it be nurturing. It's one of those ways we can really take good care of ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's really nice when people can come to that place where it's a part of your life, where it's a self-caring, nurturing practice, and where it's also not that big a deal. Like that sort of dialectic of like, it's wonderful and pleasurable and it makes me feel good. And I have a million other things in my life that are kind of, more important to focus on and that make me feel good too. It's not my only thing. It's not the be all end all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just said it.
Well, so tell us where people can learn more about you, learn more about the book. Obviously, they should go listen to your first episode as well to hear more of your story. But for more on the book and gentle nutrition or common sense nutrition, as you say, where can people go?
Well, my website is anourishingword.com, like a nourishing word, WORD.com. And that's information about my practice. And you can purchase the book right there on my website. You can also purchase it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble or find booksellers everywhere too. But I always love for people to purchase it on my website. And, I'm very happy to, send signed copies for those that want them as well. But I mostly can be found online and I'm fairly accessible for those that want to talk about groups or individual work if you're in the greater Boston area. And when I'm full, I have wonderful colleagues all around me that I love to send people to.
Yeah, as we talked about in your last episode, Boston is a hub for some good eating disorder recovery work.
I feel very blessed to be here. Yes, it's a mecca a little bit for recovery work, but that's, I think that's great for the people who live here. And for those who don't, I'm glad that people like you and I are writing books and putting resources out there in other places.
I know. Yeah, we need to paper the earth with books about this stuff because it's so important. Well, thank you so much for being here again. It's always great to talk with you, Heidi.
Well, thank you so much, Christy, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always fun.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Heidi Schauster for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you want some practical guidance from me for your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Head over to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/168. That's christyharrison.com/168. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcasting platform, whatever you're using to listen to this, use it to share the podcast. Also, make sure you're subscribed so that you never miss an episode. You can go to christyharrison.com/subscribe to see all the different places you can do that. christyharrison.com/subscribe. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, and to my Food Psych programs team, including our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and the music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put